You know, when you see a toxic mushroom cloud erupting on the border between Ohio and Pennsylvania, you tend to get a little bit nervous. I know it's not as dramatic as a Chinese spy balloon getting shot down, but still, that shouldn't be happening. And I know that there's a lot of attention on Pete Buttigieg and his response, since this was the result of a train derailment, and he seems to be nowhere to be found. But this is also an environmental disaster. Toxins are spilling into the Ohio River, kind of an important river in America, as well as being burned into the air and seeping into the ground. Quick, who's the administrator of the EPA? Yeah, exactly. His name's Michael Regan. Last time I checked in the news, he had 2 items of note. A couple weeks ago, he was floating the idea of leaving the EPA to start on a new career, which I guess explains why he hasn't said anything about this disaster. Oh, and also he secured funding for electric school buses somewhere. There's your EPA in action. Joining us right now is Mandy Gunasekara. She was the chief of staff of the EPA in the Trump administration, now a candidate for Mississippi Public Service Commissioner, Northern District. Mandy, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I mean, maybe I'm overstating the case, because I know all we care about is carbon emissions due to, driving your car. But it seems like this is a pretty serious issue for the Environmental Protection Agency.
It's a very serious issue, Larry, and this is a continuation of an absentee president that has brought on an absentee cabinet. Pete Buttigieg isn't anywhere to be seen, and neither is Administrator Michael Regan. I can tell you, if I were still chief of staff at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, my former boss, Administrator Andrew Wheeler, would have been there very soon after something like this happened, not only to be there as a comforting presence to make sure that everything was contained and being appropriately handled, but also to communicate vital information that the surrounding communities need in order to be safe and to stay safe. It's an absolute embarrassment, and it's a major problem indicative of this administration's lack of seriousness to issues that impact the American people in real time.
Well, listen, I would also guarantee you that the media would be all over you and your former boss and your boss's boss, the President of the United States. I mean, this would be another example of why Donald Trump is a disaster as president. But here, nothing happening from the media on this story. In fact, they had to be shamed into covering it. Just in terms of this being a normal occurrence or such. I mean, I know that chemicals are transported across the country on trains and sometimes on trucks, and chemicals can be very good and beneficial when used properly, but obviously this is a problem when you've got chemicals spilled like this. I mean, what kind of safeguards are supposed to be in place to ensure that this sort of thing doesn't happen? Because you don't hear about it happening very often.
Well, a lot of it has to do with the long-term maintenance of the infrastructure itself, the railroads. I was reading something, this probably had more to do with an axle breaking on the wheels of the train. And so it's this longer term infrastructure oversight and management that is increasingly important, alongside compliance with very strict regulations. We transport lots of chemicals all the time, and something like this, fortunately, is the exception. But the problem here in this administration, and we saw this in the Obama administration, we called their parade of horrible environmental disasters that the media would not cover. Things like the Flint, Michigan water crisis, things like the Gold King vine spill. We're seeing a reoccurrence of that here in the Biden administration because they are so focused on chasing climate change and this abstract environmental justice instead of focusing on the real needs that affect the health of local populations, the environment today. And so that's why you are seeing this breakdown for something that is very simple in terms of maintaining infrastructure.
It's a critically important point. The EPA was started by a Republican president, by the way, Richard Nixon, and the whole idea was to clean up environmental problems just like this, not to regulate invisible carbon emissions that theoretically might be affecting the climate decades or centuries from now. But it seems like that's all the EPA focuses on when a Democrat's in the White House.
Yeah, that's right. They focus on the abstract and in hundreds to thousands of years into the future, while ignoring their responsibility of what they should be doing today, which is cleaning up the air, cleaning up the water, addressing legacy pollution, and making sure environmental disasters like this do not happen. And then when they do happen, it's showing up to make sure that the cleanup occurs properly and fast and protects the surrounding people and environment.
You know, that's a critically important thing that you said there in terms of showing up and communicating properly to the people in the area. Because, first, My understanding of the timeline here, and again, sadly, the media hasn't reported on it nearly enough, but my understanding is this train derailment happens, the chemical spill occurs, suddenly you start seeing dead wildlife, fish floating up in the Ohio River, foxes and other woodland creatures showing up just dropping dead. And so the EPA comes in. They decided, or officials of some sort decided, that a controlled burn was the way to mitigate the chemical leak. But again, now you've got toxins in the air, and the communications were so stilted or even non-existent that the people in the area didn't know what was going on, and forgive them as they smell these toxins in the air for thinking that they're being poisoned.
It's so crazy, and it would not have happened in our administration. The fact that this administration gets a free pass, it's because they are more interested in protecting their own political back than they are doing what's right to protect the people who are actually being impacted by this disaster. Now, at EPA, we have something called the Office of Land and Emergency Management, and they have emergency responders that can go on the scene and help contain the disaster. But the communication to the surrounding public is just as important as containing the actual disaster itself. And that's what's been lackluster here. And it's frustrating that the mainstream media isn't asking more questions, isn't curious about this as they are about the Chinese balloon, as you rightfully pointed out in your opening statement.
Mandy, it's funny. Last night on social media, there were two trending issues related to this. One was Atlas Shrugged, because it looks like the breakdown, especially with all the train derailments. It's right out of the first third of that book. But also Chernobyl. Because oftentimes when you see a government mismanagement of a public disaster, especially one with potentially dangerous substances like we're seeing here, you don't really know the impact until decades later. And then at that point, the government's like, oh yeah, I guess we got that one wrong. I mean, based on your experience as the chief of staff of the EPA, what would you be looking out for right now? What should local officials be looking out for to hold the federal government accountable?
Yeah, so they need to be monitoring the presence and the degree of how many chemicals are getting out there. And I suspect that there will be people on the ground long term monitoring the presence of these chemicals in the surrounding water, following those chemicals to make sure they don't get into the larger drinking water system. Because this Ohio, I was just reading, it is a water resource to millions of citizens in Ohio, West Virginia, and some of the surrounding state areas. So a lot of it has to do with monitoring and staying on top of where these chemicals that go up into the atmosphere ultimately land, and then making sure when those chemicals and the presence is detected, they are giving information and resources to those that clean the water system so that they can take hazardous chemicals out and protect the communities going forward. But it is a longer term play, and so much of how well that longer term play ends up is dependent on the actions taken on day one. And what we've seen from this administration is a lack of seriousness and interest as they are off chasing their climate change agenda.
Well, exactly. I find this to be almost an allegory of where the Democratic Party has gone. This used to be Democrat country. This is blue collar, Rust Belt kind of area. And now they care about Davos and carbon emissions and what they can do to save the planet from, hot weather. And they've completely left in the dust. They don't care anymore about the people who are living on the ground there who are suffering due to their mismanagement.
Yeah, they've turned their back on the American people. And these are the American people that President Trump brought into the Republican Party. He showed them that, no, you are no longer forgotten. And yes, we are going to first listen to you and third take care of you. And so, yeah, you're exactly right. This is an allegory of the shifting tide of politics. These people, they don't deserve this type of treatment, even under a Democrat administration, and they need to be taken care of.
Quickly, and only 30 seconds left, what should be done with Administrator Regan right now? What kind of oversight should be done here? Because he is missing in action. He's on a milk carton, Mandy.
Yeah, he's trying to figure out what his next steps are going to be. And I should say that's kind of been the case for EPA from the start. The person who really was calling the shots from the start of the administration was over in the White House, the climate czar, Gina McCarthy, and they did this to try and avoid congressional oversight. So now that we have Republicans over in Congress, they need to be writing letters, asking questions, and bringing Michael Regan up to testify on this issue and the relative response.
Yeah, let's listen. I'm all for the pylon on Pete Buttigieg. This is a transportation problem because of the derailment, but let's not lose sight of the fact the EPA has a role here, and they're completely missing. Mandy Gunasekara, thank you for joining us on this. More to come on O'Connor tonight. You're watching Salem News Channel.